Chapter 29 Origen. We come now to the father who is, in more than one respect, the greatest in the first 3 centuries, namely Origen. His extensive learning, his mental depth, intensity and freshness, his patient industry, his fervent piety and love, his blameless life from his youth up, these were all adorned with genuine Christian humility, more rare than his gifts or his reputation. Though his life may be divided into 2 periods, that which he spent in Alexandria up till 230 AD, and that which he spent in Palestine, particularly in Caesarea, and which extended to the time of his death, it was only the outward scene of his work that was different in the 2 periods. The manner and spirit of his labours and the end he pursued, the development of the Christian gnosis based on Holy Scripture, were still the same. The character of his labours was little affected by the circumstances that in Palestine he was invested with an ecclesiastical office, and so was authorised to deliver discourses in assemblies for public worship. But the life of the scholar was by no means untroubled. He suffered from the persecution of the Roman power, and though no man had more devoted adherents both nigh and far off, he had enemies within the church, and he had to bear envy and jealousy, and wounded hierarchical pride. Origen, surnamed the Adamantine, Adamadinos, was born in Alexandria about the year 185 AD. He was the firstborn of Christian parents. His father Leonides was, it has been conjectured, a teacher of the Greek language and literature. Whether he followed this occupation or not, it hardly admits of question that, in the numerous and cultivated community of Alexandria, there were already grammarians and rhetoricians, so that, in this city at least, the children of those who professed the faith were not under the necessity of sitting at the feet of heathen masters in order to acquire the knowledge of ancient learning. Leonides, at all events, was the instructor of his son, and, while he introduced him into the elements of general culture, he made it his special care to familiarize him with the Holy Scripture, not allowing a day to pass on which the boy did not learn by heart and repeat considerable portions of it. Even in those early days, the spirit, at once critical and mystical, by which Origen was afterwards characterized, manifested itself in a way which caused some embarrassment to the teacher, and which the teacher thought it right to censure or to restrain, but for which he appears to have given God thanks in secret. It is touching to read how, when the boy whom he had somewhat reproved for excessive curiosity was asleep, he bent over the young breast, regarding it with reverence as a special dwelling place of the divine spirit. It would seem that, whatever difficulties presented themselves to the youth, he never stumbled at the supreme authority of the Scriptures. It never occurred to him to question it. He encountered many passages, however, of which the literal sense was sufficiently plain, but which, he conjectured, would not have been there at all, had there not lain under them a deeper, richer, more spiritual meaning. In his early youth there was added to the paternal instruction that of the eminent teachers of the catechetical school, certainly of Clement, probably also of Pantaenus. That influence, however, was not long enjoyed. We know that the edict of Septimus Severus, issued in 202 AD, forbidding conversion to Judaism or to Christianity, was in many quarters, and not least in Alexandria, interpreted most widely and cruelly. Christians belonging not only to the city, but to the whole country round about, were here tried and executed. Scarcely had the persecution broken out when Origen gave evidence of the qualities which entitle him, not less than his indomitable spirit of inquiry entitle him, to the name Adamantine. He showed a moral courage, a religious earnestness and devotion which are not less the admirable because they passed into a dangerous enthusiasm, which in later years he would have in no wise justified. Far from being intimidated by the sight of the numerous martyrdoms of which his native city was the scene, he was so wrought upon by them in his youthful mind that he purposed to offer himself voluntarily to the persecutors, that he too might win the crown, and nothing could restrain him but the urgent entreaties of his mother. This was before a blow was aimed at his own home. But when his father was apprehended, the youth's desire to share his lot became uncontrollable, and the mother, it is recorded, knew no other way of restraining him than by hiding his clothes, doubtless till she extorted the promise to spare her the agony which she must feel if her firstborn accompanied her husband to death. Such enthusiasm as Origen's has, of course, both in ancient and in later times, been more or less common, and more or less tainted with weakness and sin, but found in a youth of 17 years, and being the outbreak of a fire which we know never ceased to burn far down and all through, it cannot but attract us. It indicates a rich spiritual nature in the greatest student of Christian antiquity, in one who indeed lived for study, but lived for study because he lived for God. But more remarkable still than that enthusiasm, or rather flowing out of it and proving how little there was in it of vanity and self-love, was his anxiety that his father, with whom he was not permitted to share death, should not lose the martyr's crown. As the tender recollection of his family, and, among the rest, of the boy who had put to him so many questions, might cause him to waver, he wrote a letter to encourage and strengthen him, and to lighten to him the sacrifice. "Beware, my father," he said, "that thou do not change your mind for our sake." So wrote the eldest of 7 children, bidding his father stand fast, though his life should be taken and his property confiscated. There is not in the annals of ancient persecution a more notable example of that moral and spiritual strength which knows nothing of flesh and blood when the question is between confessing Christ and denying him. Leonides remained steadfast and was executed. In the hour of need, a rich and noble lady of Alexandria, who is nowhere named, but who is said to have been a Christian, interested herself in the bereaved and impoverished family. The lady must have been of a remarkable character, for into her hospitable dwelling she received not only a Christian, but a heretical Gnostic named Paulus, and even treated him as an adopted son. This Paulus is described as a man of great acquirements and eloquence, whose discourses, delivered in the house into which he had been received, were attended not only by heretics, but by orthodox Christians. The singular thing, I need hardly explain, is not that at that period a Christian should show kindness to a Gnostic or to a heathen, but that she should enter into such close relations both with Origen and Paulus. But the probability is, though this is a mere conjecture, that she sympathized with the latter. She could otherwise hardly have adopted him, not to say that, however friendly to free discussion, she would hardly have allowed her house to be used for the dissemination of heretical tenets which she did not share. As for Origen, he was little more than a boy, and probably the benevolent lady, moved by his affliction, did not concern herself at this time about his opinions, and did not anticipate any collision between him and Paulus. No such collision indeed seems to have taken place, though, according to Eusebius, whose testimony on a point of this kind is by many considered very doubtful, while they held free and friendly intercourse, Origen took care that they should never have prayers together. Origen soon acquired such proficiency in grammar, this word being then understood as comprehending many branches of learning that are now considered separate sciences, such as the knowledge of antiquities, the history of literature, and even theology, that he was able to impart instruction in it, and so to earn a livelihood. But this occupation, though he never undervalued it, could not permanently satisfy him, and soon there was opened for him a path in which he recognized his proper vocation and destiny. It was reserved for him, though scarcely 18 years of age, to fill up the gap which Clement had left in Alexandria by his flight from the persecution. In any circumstances, it required great courage to step into this vacant place at so perilous a juncture, but the young Origen did so willingly, and in the first instance without the official commission of the bishop, though not without a call from without, which seemed to him to warrant the course he took. Some heathens applied to him with request to give them instruction in Christianity. Probably his prelections had sometimes brought him on the religious territory, and he had thus inspired some of his hearers with a desire to obtain a more perfect knowledge of the way of salvation. At all events, when we remember the nature of the edict which had recently been issued, it is evident that they must have been deeply in earnest, and so they gave Origen the opportunity of trading with his pound in the way in which it would yield the richest return. His scholars soon became numerous, and the bishop Demetrius, having his attention called to the young teacher, formally and officially appointed him to the head of the catechetical school. This was not, however, properly speaking, an ecclesiastical office, and required no consecration. Origen, soon finding that his new labours demanded his undivided strength, abandoned his previous occupation, by which he had earned his support. He sold, however, a number of copies of old works, which he had written with his own hand, and the sale brought him an annuity which yielded him 4 oboli a day, a sum which, as his way of life was extremely simple, even abstemious, was sufficient for his maintenance. He accepted nothing for the instruction he gave in the catechetical school, although the scholars made him many offers. A violent renewal of the persecution which took place in the year 203 AD on the arrival of the proconsul Aquila sorely tried Origen's devotion, and showed that the former fire had not been extinguished by his father's blood or by the cold blast of poverty and hardship. Plutarch, the first of his scholars, was the first to pay for his conversion with his life. Others also perished by the sword or, in the language of the historian, received the baptism of fire, sometimes after manifold torture. Their teacher and friend visited them in prison, was with them at their trial, and, when sentence was pronounced, accompanied them to the place of execution and gave them the pastoral kiss. More than once it happened that, when he embraced and encouraged them, the heathen who stood by were filled with fury and were on the point of stoning him. Plutarch's kinsman, for example, who did not share the martyr's faith, loudly exclaimed that the teacher was to blame for the disciples' death. Meanwhile, in spite of the persecution, the number of those who attended the catechetical school increased, and the curiosity thus excited was so great that a mob, in the midst of which were imperial troops, gathered before Origen's dwelling. He escaped, however, and fled from house to house till the storm was past. Some have expressed astonishment that he was not formally tried and condemned like the brethren whom he consoled and strengthened. The explanation may be, though there was not much, there was a little regard felt for the letter of the imperial edict. Fieri Christianos sub gravi pona vetuit. It was forbidden under severe penalty that any should become Christians. These words might be strained and applied to men who had been converts for a considerable period, especially if they were seeking to convert others, but the most bloodthirsty might hesitate to extend them to one who was notoriously lacte Christiano educatus, reared on the milk of Christianity, the son of a well-known citizen who had doubtless trained up his children in the religion for which he died. Origen's asceticism is remarkable. He has created surprise that he, of all men, should take literally or understand as of universal application many New Testament sayings and injunctions that are not commonly so interpreted. He mortified the flesh by voluntary and severe privation. He fasted often, and he abstained wholly from wine and flesh. He wore no shoes, and had only one coat. After labouring assiduously during the day, he devoted the greater part of the night to the study of Holy Scriptures, which he knew almost entirely by heart, and when he lay down to sleep, it was not on a bed, not even on straw, but on the bare ground. Origenes Adamantinus could live on his 4 oboli a day. He wished no more, and some who felt themselves his debtors and would gladly have given him largely of their substance, he grieved deeply by the decided refusal of every gift. That he understood Matthew 24 verse 12 literally and, in consequence of his interpretation, did himself violence, is a story which is related by almost every ecclesiastical historian. We find it, for example, in Kurtz, who, like most others, records it without indicating the slightest doubt of its truth. That the charge was brought against Origen at a later period of his life is undeniable, but the evidence that can be adduced to show that it was well founded is so far from being conclusive that I should scarcely refer to the story at all, but for its almost universal acceptance. For a number of years Origen continued to labour with growing success, which was attested by the conversion of both men and women. In consequence of the increasing numbers, and with the view of gaining more time for the investigation of divine truth, he associated himself with his friend Heraclas, who was a brother of the martyr Plutarch, and one of his first scholars, and who became subsequently, on the death of Demetrius, Bishop of Alexandria. To this Heraclas, Origen entrusted the task of instructing the younger and weaker, that he might devote his own time to the more advanced. But, eminently successful as he had been, he began to feel that he was not perfectly equipped for the fulfilment of his vocation. Partly constrained by the character of the men who frequented the catechetical school, some of them heathens and some of them heretics, and partly impelled by the thirst for inquiry which was inherent in his nature, he became in his turn a pupil. He betook himself to the most famous philosopher of his time, Ammonius Saccas, the founder of Neoplatonism, a man who has left nothing in writing, but whose greatness and influence have been celebrated by his scholars Plotinus and Longinus. Origen, said Porphyry, the scholar of Plotinus, who flourished in the second half of the century, was a scholar of Ammonius, and made great progress in philosophy. He belonged, however, to the barbarous and corrupt sect of Christians, and so corrupted and falsified the excellent things which he had learned, mixing up outlandish fables with the true doctrines of God and the universe. On the other hand, it has often been contended, possibly in terms greatly exaggerated, that it was not the Neoplatonic philosophy, but Christianity, that suffered in Origen's hands after his studies under Ammonius Saccas. But, whatever the result, the object of Origen had undoubtedly been that he might enable himself to combat the philosophical opponents of Christianity the better on their own ground, and, while defending the faith with appropriate weapons, to find, at the same time, in heathen wisdom, wherever such could be recognized, appropriate points of connection with Christianity. But there was another gap in his knowledge which Origen set himself to fill up. He put himself at the feet of a Jew in order to learn Hebrew. This is a remarkable circumstance, as the fathers generally were not only content with the Septuagint, but appear to have regarded it as equally inspired and authoritative with the original. Origen's blissful and glorious labour, prosecuted for many years, was interrupted by occasional journeys. He visited Rome in the bishopric of Zephyrinus, about 215 AD. Several years later, 218, Julia Mamaea, the mother of the Emperor Alexander Severus, invited him to Antioch when she was residing there. In her desire to converse with the celebrated teacher, she had sent a detachment of soldiers to Alexandria to escort him thence. That Julia Mamaea received some favourable impressions from her illustrious visitor and communicated them to her son has already been noticed as a thing by no means improbable. Previously, however, there had been a departure from Alexandria of another sort. It was occasioned by disturbances in the city. Probably it was when the Emperor Caracalla, to whom Papinian had said that it was easier to commit a parricide than to justify it, was present in Alexandria, 216 AD, and was inflicting shocking cruelties there, particularly upon the scholars. Whatever the precise occasion may have been, Origen left Egypt. He betook himself to Palestine, and took up his residence in Caesarea. His friends, Alexander, Bishop of Jerusalem, and Theoctistus, Bishop of Caesarea, urged him to deliver discourses in the church, and Origen, though not yet a presbyter, complied. Demetrius, the Bishop of Alexandria, was incensed at this violation of order, and wrote violently to the bishops of Palestine, who, however, saw nothing wrong in allowing the catechist to preach, especially as he preached in their presence. Demetrius could not be appeased. He insisted on Origen's return, and Origen, it is said, obeyed the summons. Possibly, however, the love of home and of the old library, which he might again indulge without at least immediate danger, had as great an effect as the command of the indignant bishop. The various distinctions which Origen had acquired, a summons to Arabia addressed to him by the governor of that land, and the similar invitation received from Julia Mamaea, excited the envy and jealousy of others, probably of Demetrius the bishop himself. We have just seen that Demetrius could not control his indignation and entered into a violent correspondence with the bishops of Jerusalem and Caesarea because they had invited Origen to preach in the public assemblies of Christians, he being invested with no ecclesiastical office. Subsequently, about the year 228 AD, when Origen was summoned to Achaia to conduct some business, of which nothing is known with certainty, he took his way over Palestine, and at Caesarea the bishop Theoctistus, with the concurrence of Alexander, Bishop of Jerusalem, ordained him a presbyter, probably because they were again desirous that he should address the churches, and sought to overcome all objections by conferring on him the qualification that, in the view of his spiritual superior at Alexandria, was absolutely indispensable. But Demetrius, who had once been a warm friend, was not to be satisfied. And for Origen to have received office from other hands than his was, in his eyes, as great an offence as that of preaching without holding any ecclesiastical office at all. When the object of his displeasure returned in 230 AD, all was changed. Origen was suspected, distrusted, and charged with all sorts of heresy, and, to escape the storm which was gathering, he departed, consoling himself with that passage of John with which he happened then to be occupied in preparing his commentary on that gospel that represents Jesus as commanding the winds and waves of the sea. The tempest burst forth soon after his departure. A synod of Egyptian bishops and some presbyters declared him unworthy of the office of catechist and excluded him from the fellowship of the church, and a second assembly, consisting of bishops entirely under the influence of Demetrius, deposed him from the office of presbyter. It is probable that in this high-handed procedure, to which Demetrius was the chief instigator, other motives than jealousy may be justly traced. The hierarchical spirit might be too powerful to be subdued by any regard to the peculiar greatness of Origen and the eminent success with which his work in Alexandria had been crowned, and moreover the departure, the flight, as it would be called, of the man whose orthodoxy was questioned, and whose presbyterial dignity had been obtained without the consent of his own bishop, might be construed as a determination not to submit, but to keep the office to which he had been appointed in a way that seemed illegitimate. Whatever the motives, the resolution to depose Origen was not only adopted at Alexandria, but communicated in a circular letter to the churches throughout the world, and was recognized by the Church of Rome and by all other churches, with the exception of those of Palestine, Phoenicia, Arabia, and Achaia. And to whom good Origen, the greatest Christian lecturer of his age, now condemned and degraded by the bishops of his own land, betake himself, but to his tried friends in Palestine, Theoctistus of Caesarea and Alexander of Jerusalem? The original home of Christianity was henceforth his own. He visited the holy spots where had trod the blessed feet of him who would take his disciple up, though all men should forsake him. The exile lingered some time at Jerusalem, as if he sought rest at the grave of his Lord. It was not here that he settled, however, but in Caesarea, the seat of the governor, a city so rich in means of culture as almost to vie with Alexandria, and, above all, the place where the gates of the heavenly kingdom had been opened to the apostles. In this city, flourishing when Jerusalem was but a shadow of its past glory, the man of adamant prosecuted his old labours as one who belonged not to Alexandria, nor indeed to Caesarea, but to his master and the world. His banishment, indeed, only contributed to the wider spread of his influence, a result which might be illustrated by many other cases in the history of the Church. Demetrius died in 232 AD, a year after decision was given against Origen, but though the deposed teacher was succeeded by Heraclas, once his own pupil, and then his fellow labourer in the catechetical school, we hear nothing of a recall, and there was no indication of a change of feeling at Alexandria when, after 16 years, Heraclas likewise was removed by death, and was followed by Dionysius, another pupil of the great exile. The natural explanation is that the Egyptian clergy were too deeply committed to the course into which they were led by Demetrius to be able to retreat from it. Among the pupils who studied under Origen when he opened at Caesarea a school similar to that which he had conducted at Alexandria was Gregory, surnamed Thaumaturgus, afterwards Bishop of Neo-Caesarea. He had come from Pontus on some family business with the intention of proceeding immediately after its settlement to Berytus, there to study Roman law. The career of an advocate was that to which his thoughts were directed when he arrived at Caesarea, but his visit to that city, taken by the way, was the turning point in his life. His good angel, he said, had brought him hither. 5 years he remained the pupil of Origen, whom, according to his own comparison, he loved as Jonathan loved David. This man, he added, binds us and holds us fast with bonds so mighty that when we remove to a distance, he does not let go our souls. But Origen was again exposed to persecution. Maximin, the murderer of Alexander Severus, turned against the Christians, and particularly their teachers, the hatred which he bore his predecessor. Origen withdrew, betaking himself to Caesarea in Cappadocia, where he had a friend in the bishop Firmilian, who sided strongly with Cyprian in the controversy about the baptism of heretics. There he lived for 2 years in the deepest retirement in the house of a Christian lady named Juliana. In this house he found an unexpected treasure in a collection of valuable books, of which Juliana had come into possession as heiress of that Symmachus, who is known by his translations of the Old Testament, and who also devoted himself to exegetical labours. Here Origen wrote his Exhortation to Martyrdom, which was addressed to his friends Ambrosius and Protoctitus, who had been imprisoned, but had evidently been liberated on the death of the emperor. On the occurrence of that event, which brought a cessation of the persecution, Origen returned to Caesarea in Palestine, and there continued his studies, occupying himself chiefly with expository labour. Various works, particularly his great work against Celsus, were written at the urgent request of his friend Ambrosius, a man of considerable means, who was wont to emphasize his entreaties by paying a number of ready writers, who wrote at Origen's dictation. He was not suffered to end in peace a life which, as we should say, began so sadly, and had been so often troubled. As he himself predicted in his writing against Celsus, the peaceful days which he had enjoyed under Philip the Arabian, with whom, and with whose wife, he is said to have held correspondence, came to a close. This was in 250 AD. When the Decian persecution broke out, Origen was seized, whether in Caesarea or in Tyre is not certain. He was cast into a dark prison, an iron chain was put on his neck, and all conceivable means, short of torturing him to death, were used to make him recant. But the son of Leonides, now an old man, bore all with patience, and survived Decius, upon whose death he was released. His friend Alexander of Jerusalem had died a martyr, and his friend Ambrosius was no more. Origen was in poverty, worn out by years of incessant labour and by cruel sufferings, but we are told that this man, after his release from prison, where he had endured agonies which doubtless hastened his end, continued to write, and to write for the comfort of such as were in sorrow and distress. He died at Tyre in the year 254 AD, and there his grave was long pointed out. The merchants and the traffickers of the crowning city had their good things, but the pride thereof has been stained. Origen's pure and great name will live, preserved by his own page, though in that land where no greater child had been born from the days of Moses, the paper reeds by the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks, should wither and be driven away and be no more. But reputation, during or after his lifetime, was not what Origen sought first. Whether he seemed to be winning or losing it, he continued worthy of the name Adamantinus, for he was steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. The writings of Origen were so numerous that, in the language of Jerome, he wrote more than most men were wont to read, yet this indefatigable author had been most reluctant to take pen in hand, except for transcribing. It was only by the urgent solicitation of Ambrosius that he was prevailed upon to compose for the world. Ambrosius had been converted by him from the heretical to the Christian gnosis. He was a man of eminence and wealth, and he not only provided transcribers, but, what was scarcely less needful, purchased for him a number of expensive manuscripts. This man, whose support was extremely valuable, and being offered not for a personal but for a public end, was not rejected, Origen used to call his ergodioctis, his taskmaster, as we might render it. Many of the books published with the assistance of this friend are now lost, or are only partially preserved. Some of them, however, are almost entire, and one or two of them it is necessary to notice. Origen may be called the founder of the science of textual criticism. By comparing the Septuagint with some other Greek translations of the Old Testament, as well as through disputations in which he engaged with the Jews, he found that the commonly received text often failed to render the original correctly. There arose, therefore, a need which Origen, whose knowledge of Hebrew was never thorough, did not attempt to meet by himself publishing a new version, but by a sort of synoptical juxtaposition of the 70 with other Greek translations, and with the Hebrew text. He at least furnished the means of ascertaining, by the comparison, the extent of the discrepancies, and so, in most cases, the true sense of the original. The arrangement of the work was as follows. In the first column was the Hebrew text in Hebrew characters, in the second the Hebrew text in Greek characters, and in the third the version of Aquila, and in the fourth that of Symmachus, and in the fifth the Septuagint, and in the sixth that of Theodotion, so that there were 6 columns, the hexapla. The principle of arrangement was the degree of close and rigid adherence to the original, but in some parts there were more than 6 columns, Origen availing himself of translations of certain portions of the Old Testament, hence octapla and sometimes even enneapla. But there was also an edition called the tetrapla, containing 4 versions, those namely of Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, and the 70, being the same as the hexapla without its 2 columns for the Hebrew. It is believed that marginal notes were added to this critical apparatus, but from the nature of the edition, few copies of it were needed, and though the great ecclesiastical writers of the immediately succeeding ages profited by it, and introduced citations from it into their pages, the work, as a whole, has long ago perished. Origen's own copy, or copies, having been discovered 50 years after his death, probably at Tyre, fell into the hands of the martyr Pamphilus of Caesarea, and remained in the library there, where Jerome saw it and took advantage of it, till 652 AD, when Caesarea was captured by the Saracens. Various editions of the fragments of the hexapla that could be collected have been published more than once since the beginning of last century. In the time of Origen, alarm was already excited by the number of various readings in the New Testament manuscripts, arising partly from negligence and partly from wilful corruption. It is well that attention was early called to the evil, though it may be called to it then, as it was at later times, in exaggerated language. Origen appears to have devoted much time to critical inquiries in this territory also, and, though he did not undertake a complete recension of the text of the New Testament, there were at least in circulation, according to the testimony of Jerome, manuscripts of portions of it revised and amended by him. And so, among other obligations under which he laid the Church of the future, we owe it in great measure to him that the corruption did not spread so widely as otherwise it would have. Origen's exegetical writings consisted partly of scholia, also called semiosis, brief notes on detached passages that seemed specially to need explanation, and commentaries, tome, embracing a great part of the Old Testament and the greater part of the New. With these are usually classed his homilies, or popular expositions, delivered after his 16th year. His character as a commentator is thus given by a French writer. He commonly says everything which occurs to him with respect to some word that he meets with, and he affects great refinement in his speculations, which often leads him to resort to airy and allegorical meanings. But notwithstanding these faults, we find in his commentaries on the New Testament profound learning, and an extensive acquaintance with everything respecting religion, nor is there any writer from whom we can learn so well as from him what the ancient theology was. He had carefully read a great number of writers of whom we scarcely know the names. That in these commentaries, and also in the homilies, allegory should abound does not surprise us when we remember that their author was the countryman and student of Philo, and the pupil of Clement, and of the founder of the Neoplatonic school. Origen's method is not new, but his manner of defending it is noteworthy. He justifies it psychologically as a trichotomist. As a man consists of body, soul, and spirit, so, he taught, Holy Scripture has a threefold sense, a literal, by which, however, he does not mean the grammatico-historical sense, but that of the naked letter, a moral and a spiritual. Besides the first, which is to be regarded as the body, there is a second, the moral, which corresponds with the soul, the historical as well as the didactic portions containing lessons and warnings which form a moral mirror for the human race. But still higher, vastly higher, he places the third sense, corresponding with the spirit, by which are apprehended not only our actual relations to the unseen and eternal, but conditions and events in the supramundane, pre-mundane, and post-mundane universe. To penetrate these deeper mysteries is the privilege only of him who enjoys the illumination of the Spirit that inspired the Scriptures. It is manifest that Origen, the father of textual criticism, the man who spent 3 years of his life in compiling the hexapla, was far from being a slave to the letter. Too far. The main charge brought against him with reason is that he does not give the letter its due place. The man that insisted that Celsus should have either rejected all or accepted all in the gospel history denied in many cases that the literal sense, sometimes even when it coincided with the grammatico-historical, was a true sense at all. Although there the passage stood, inspired, and inspired whether he could always discover the deep mystical meaning or not, for a wise end. A literal sense, he maintains, is not always true, there being intermingled with the narratives not a few things whereby the attention of the reader might be recalled by the impossibility of the case to an examination of the inner meaning. On this point let us hear his own words, and though we may by no means accept all his illustrations, we shall admit that he has something to say for his theory. Who is there, pray, possessed of understanding that will regard the statement as appropriate that the first day and the second and the third, in which also both evening and morning are mentioned, existed without sun and moon and stars, the first day even without a sky, And who is found so ignorant as to suppose that God planted a visible and palpable tree of wood, so that anyone eating of it with bodily teeth should obtain life, and eating again of another tree should come to the knowledge of good and evil? So of God walking, and Adam hiding himself in the garden. The departure of Cain from the presence of the Lord will manifestly cause a careful reader to inquire what is the presence of God, and how anyone can go out from it. How could the devil literally show from a high mountain the kingdoms of the world, and how the kings of these kingdoms be glorified by men? The passage concerning smiting on the right cheek cannot, for more than one reason, be taken literally, for a man, unless he happen to have a bodily defect, first strikes the left cheek with the right hand. So, when both eyes have the property of sight, why should the responsibility of the offence committed by that sense be transferred to one eye, and that the right? The Holy Spirit himself makes it plain that we are not to be edified by the letter alone, or by anything in it, but that many things were interwoven which, when understood in their inner meaning, give forth a law which is advantageous to men worthy of God. To the deep and mystical meaning Origen attaches vast importance. Our eyes must be opened if we are to behold wondrous things out of God's law. The treasure is in earthen vessels, in the vulgar and unpolished vessels of words, as he says in the Periachon. We shall sometimes find 3 senses, we may expect to find at least 2. These earthen vessels contain 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Take an illustration of one containing 3, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose. The moral sense, equally with the literal, is obvious, since the external act cannot, of course, be considered apart from the corresponding sentiment. But what is the treasure contained in the earthen vessel? To contemplate Christ in his low estate as he dwelt among us, and understand in the same degree the mystery of the Incarnation, is to unloose the latchet of one of his shoes. But there are 2 shoes. Christ stooped lower than the dust of the earth. As David tells us in the 16th Psalm, and Peter in his first epistle, he descended in spirit to Hades. And to comprehend something of the mystery of that descent by which he became Lord of the dead as well as the living, is to unloose the latchet of the other shoe. How arbitrary, fanciful, unnatural this is need not be said. The instance is one of 1,000. In his own allegorizing style, he compares the Old and New Testaments in the mere letter with the ass and the ass's colt. They must be loosed by the disciples. The deeper senses must be disclosed before Christ can make his triumphant entry on the ass and the colt into the city, the soul of the believer. If anything in the way of interpretation could be worse than Origen's perpetual hunt after allegorical meanings, it was the opposite extreme of servile literalism, which, as Origen himself endeavoured to show, was the mother of unbelief, as in the case of the Jews, and of heresy in the case of the Marcionites, the cause of an unworthy conception of God, and therefore of immorality, in the case of both many Jews and of many heretics, and of multitudes who could be classed with neither. It is but just to say further that, notwithstanding his baseless, airy interpretations, he not only shows himself in his commentaries, as in his other writings, to be a man of solid and profound learning and of acute, original mind, but uniformly respects the tradition of the Church, which in his day was pure, and while he sets forth vital truth in accordance with this rule of faith, does not call in question any of the main facts recorded in Scripture. I cannot speak at any length of Origen as an apologist. Let me give one passage from his work against Celsus. What god or spirit or prudent man, asks Celsus, would not, on foreseeing that such events were to befall him, avoid them if he could, whereas he threw himself headlong into those things which he knew beforehand were to happen? And yet Socrates, answers Origen, knew that he would die after drinking the hemlock, and it was in his power, if he had allowed himself to be persuaded by Crito, by escaping from prison, to avoid these calamities, but nevertheless he decided, as it appeared consistent with right reason, that it was better for him to die as became a philosopher than to retain life in a manner unbecoming one. Leonidas also, the Lacedaemonian general, knowing that he was on the point of dying with his followers at Thermopylae, did not make any effort to preserve his life by disgraceful means, but said to his companions, "Let us go to breakfast, as we shall sup in Hades." And where is the wonder if Jesus, knowing all things that were to happen, did not avoid them, but encountered what he foreknew, when Paul, his own disciple, having heard what would befall him when he went up to Jerusalem, proceeded to face the danger, reproaching those who are weeping around him, and endeavouring to prevent him from going up to Jerusalem. Many also of our contemporaries, knowing well that if they made a confession of Christianity they would be put to death, but that if they denied it they would be liberated and their property restored, despised life and voluntarily selected death for the sake of their religion. Origen is commonly called the father of preaching, though the designation is more liable to be misunderstood than the designation of him as the father of textual criticism and of systematic theology, or as the first of commentators. The title is given him because he is the first divine who has bequeathed discourses to posterity, although undoubtedly there are treatises of an earlier date which may have been in great part composed of matter originally delivered to the assembled people. Origen was never a pastor. When he began to preach, he was not even a presbyter. Of the 200 homilies that have been preserved, few are written down by Origen himself. Most are written by shorthand writers after he was 60 years of age. The Greek original, however, of almost all of them has been lost, and in the Latin translations liberties have been taken on some doctrinal points. But though the material for judging may not be complete, it is ample enough to justify the conclusion that the father of preaching was not a preacher of the highest order, although of course it may seem hard to compare him with the pulpit orators who followed. He has expressed many just views on preaching. The great business of the preacher, he held, was not to fight with pagan philosophers, or to plunge with the Gnostics into the unfathomable depths of the eternal past, but to dig wells in the field of Scripture, and draw plenteous water, not only for those who were of the household of faithful Abraham, but for the camels also, that is, for the ignorant and perverse. The history of the Church from the days of the Apostles had told of no more devout, self-denying servant of God, and yet he was so far from counting himself to have attained that, as we are told by a venerable father, once when he was about to deliver a discourse, his eye fell accidentally on Psalm 50, verse 16. What hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? And he burst into tears and could not utter a word. But though he was a man of most ardent religious nature, we do not read of his audience at any time being overcome. He had hearers, some of them of great eminence, who were interested and edified vastly more by him than by any other, but he had no occasion, as Chrysostom often had, and Augustine sometimes had, to rebuke the multitude for their boisterous applause. He was interrupted, however. Some of the people, forgetful of the time and place, and as little sensible of the peculiar greatness of Origen as he was himself, instead of listening to him, talked to one another, and at times, in the more remote parts of the building, were not only voluble but vociferous. The clear stream of his eloquence, although it might be full, even to overflowing, never became a torrent. Sincere and grave, though possibly not always incorrupt, he was tranquil and composed. There was no tragic vein in him, though his life was sometimes tragic enough, and it lay not at all in his nature, and down to the Dark Ages it was not expected of the sacred orator to entertain his audience with low comedy. He was no stranger to the obvious homiletical principle that the preacher should adapt himself to a mixed multitude. He himself inculcated it and acted upon it, but he came down to the people only in the sense of striving to make himself intelligible to them, in which, if they chose to attend, he was generally successful. We are not to suppose that allegory was the rock on which Origen split. His mystical interpretations were not incomprehensible, and they were not necessarily less effective than the rest of his discourse. Many great preachers have allegorized in a way most attractive and edifying, usually, no doubt, offering their imagery as accommodation or application, and not as exposition. But take the greatest preachers between Chrysostom and Luther. St. Bernard found everywhere, like Origen, the threefold sense, the garden, as he called the literal sense, and then the cellar, in neither of which he was wont to linger, and the bridal chamber, as he called the mystical. From any text in which the redeemed soul communes with its Lord who has betrothed it to himself forever, he could rise and raise his hearers with him to holy and rapt contemplation, believing all the while that he was led by the Spirit into the truth of which every word and every particle of Scripture was full. It was not, then, because he allegorized beyond limits which no one has defined, but which all agree he transgressed, that Origen's fame as an orator does not approach that which he won as a teacher, a theologian, and an apologist. It is to be noticed, however, and the remark applies to other productions than his homilies, that Origen is by no means always confident that he is right in his exegesis. he who was careful to tell us that he could not dogmatize on the tenets which are afterwards called Origenistic, such as the restoration of all fallen spirits to their first estate, does not propound his mystical meanings as infallibly the sense of Scripture, claiming no more authority for them than for his other private opinions. And, with all his allegorizing tendencies, Origen believed in the name of Christ just as the least speculative of his brethren in Alexandria or in Caesarea, and it was given to him, as we have seen, to suffer for Christ's name. His persecution was borne with meekness. He could hit the dead Chelses hard enough at times, but against his worst living foes he was never bitter. On the other hand, he was never intoxicated by the eulogies of his friends. If anyone ever kept his heart with all diligence and, with God's help, watched not in vain, it was Origen. But now all men not only recognize his singular gifts and influence, but judge mildly of him, even from a doctrinal point of view, declaring with one consent that, if he sometimes erred and could not be canonized, he cannot be classed with conscious and formal heretics. His last days were spent in Tyre. The very name of the city, where he was to find his resting place, would remind such a man of the everlasting rock on which he had built in youth. He was buried with the honourable of the earth, whose memorial has perished with them. We cannot well conceive of Origen's spirit lingering over his grave as loath to leave the body that it loved, for, though he was anything but a pessimist, the world was to him a vast penitentiary, in which fallen souls are confined and punished, each in its own cell. From his cell he was now released. He had gained the spiritual body of which Paul speaks, to be a shining orb. A shining orb he remains below, and we know the promise his Lord gave to the righteous for the kingdom above. In truth, with one or perhaps two exceptions, Origen was the greatest gift which the Father of Lights bestowed upon the Church during 14 centuries. The pervading principle of Origen was that the end must correspond with the beginning. He began every homily with a prayer and ended it with a doxology. His aim was not to leave a name ere perennius. It is rather expressed in the words with which he closes the great work of his old age. Glory be to thee, our God. Glory be to thee.